Hello, good evening, and welcome everyone to Bangalore International Centre. BIC is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversation, exchange of ideas, arts, and culture. This evening's program is Speaking Out of Syllabus, Mani Shankar Aiyar Unfiltered. Of India's civil servants, Mr. Aiyar has had arguably one of the most colourful careers with credible highs and a lot of lows. And in his new, honest memoir, he details the first 50 years of his life, from his childhood in Dehradun, his days working as the president of the Cambridge Union, from managing India's first consul in Karachi, and then working intimately with Rajiv Gandhi in the Prime Minister's office. Today, in his conversation, we'll get to see some of his personal and political highs and lows. Mr. Mani Shankar Aiyar, author and politician. Nirupama Menon Rao, Ambassador and former Foreign Secretary, Government of India. And our interlocutor this evening, journalist Nupur Basu.
So third week of August, there were two very sort of hot media picks. One was India's moon mission, and the other was Mani's memoirs.
Two happened at the same time.
Exactly, and I noted that. Were you happy? Because you've been complaining about the media right through the book. Were you happy with what the media has done for you?
Well, the Chandrayaan landed.
Mani, your mic.
The Chandrayaan landed just as my book took off. So it was beautifully harmonized.
Well done, well done. You didn't answer my question, but we'll talk about media later. I think media has been very good. Every day I've been reading major interviews, and I think many of you would have read a lot of excerpts, a lot of stuff in the book. So we'll try and tease out some of the stuff that he's written in this first 50 years of his life, which will be interesting for you. And of course, you must pick up the book. I hope it is available outside. And I want to just, before we start, also welcome Nirupama here, former Foreign Secretary. And as you know, both of them were working in Foreign Service together. I believe when Nirupama became Foreign Secretary, you told her, I wish you will be Foreign Secretary for 26 years. Is that what you said?
May I have, yes.
I think it had a lot to do with the Pakistan policy.
Right.
And the opening of dialogue. And
we will come to that later.
And he felt that was a good approach to follow, and that I was doing the right thing.
Yes, there's a lot of that in the book. We'll come to that later. But Mani, I want to start with this. So I think, first of all, what's the difference between a memoir and an autobiography? Quickly, can we go through this?
I think an autobiography is a pretentious word for memoirs. So it's really the same thing. But people like Nehru write an autobiography. People like me write memoirs.
Right. So I think one of the things that your memoir does and did for me, it really punctured this whole stereotype of Mani Shankar Aiyar being an elitist, has gone to Doon School, has gone to St. Stephen's, has gone to Cambridge. It's a different cut of Mani from the one that we actually see, the origins, son of Bhagya Lakshmi Amma, and the penury and the poverty in which you are brought up in.
Yes. She was orphaned at the age of 8 and then got herself scholarships to study on. The scholarships were the munificent sum of 5 rupees a month. And she then educated herself, managed to get into Queen Mary's College, and then joined the Madras Educational Service. And when she arrived in Visakhapatnam for her first posting in the Madras Education Service, they didn't know what to do with her because they'd never, ever met a 20-year-old woman who didn't have a family, and they didn't know where to put her up. But then somebody suggested that the Vice Chancellor of Andhra University had a large house, and maybe he could give her one of those rooms. And that's how she came to know Dr. S. Radhakrishnan, who many years later became the President of India.
Yes, and that features in the book, how you go to meet him in Raj Bhavan, in Rashtrapati Bhavan. It's also her amazing, I do want to dwell on Amma a little bit.
Yes, of
because
course.
it's so important. Her vision to put her 4 children when they come to her into this school. She literally packs you all into Doon School. Doesn't know where the money is coming from for the fees. I mean, that is an amazing chapter. I'm almost wondering if you're exaggerating.
You see, when she kidnapped us to take us to Welham School, my father was a very wealthy chartered accountant, but he was killed in an air crash in 1953 when I was just over 12 years old. So at that time, our family plunged from considerable resources to the absence of them. And she then decided that instead of spending the insurance policy on buying a house and living on the first floor and renting out the ground floor, she would put us through the same school in which my father had put us. And since we were 3 boys and all 3 of us were minors, my age was 12 and I was the oldest, she just decided that that's what we're going to do. And in exchange for keeping us in this very expensive school, there were certain restrictions placed on our consumption. For example, I had no home clothes when I was an adolescent. We used to wear our school uniform even during the holidays. So when my uncle, Minhaj Ali Mirza, decided to present me with a colorful bush shirt, which was rather like Devanand's in the film CID, I was so thrilled with this first bush shirt that I got at the age of 16 that I can tell you the date on which I bought it. It was the 16th of June, 1957. It was a historic day for me to be able to wear a shirt that it was not part of the school uniform. So but there was also this, that I found myself to be the poorest boy in the richest school. And that made me a leftist for life, because I just could not understand what there was in my very, very rich schoolmates, which put them on an assured path at the age of 17 or 18, whereas many others had to struggle. And of course, all those who were outside the walls of that school had to struggle even more. And I thought this was a very unjust society. And that resulted in my becoming something of a utopian socialist, which I continue to be. Incidentally, a utopian socialist is the most pejorative term in Karl Marx's economics. He regarded utopian socialists as fools, and I'm happy to be regarded as a fool by the founder of Marxism.
Thank you. Mani, I think we are all partitions children. And I was discussing this, Amma, your origins, your birth in Lahore, the family having to come back to India. And Nirupama was also saying how relevant this is and how people just presume where we came from and actually our origins. I want you to comment on his beginnings, yours as well.
Well, first of all, let me say that I enjoyed the book. It was fascinating. I couldn't put it down. I've actually finished it in about 18 hours. I couldn't just put it down. It's so readable, and it's so honest, and there's no, casualness about it. It's serious stuff, but it's laced through with so much of the human touch and a lot of humor. You are in splits occasionally with the kind of, funny anecdotes that are told. But in terms of origins and where we all come from, I think this book particularly, if I may call you sir, since you're a senior colleague, is important for all of us because it traces current history. It traces the history of our nation right from your birth in Lahore. You come down to India. You're witness to the first democratic elections in India. I mean, that I think, I mean, you're the first person I'm actually meeting who was witness to it. I mean, I was just a baby at that time. I don't remember anything. But you speak about that, and you speak about your upbringing, your schooling years in Doon School, and the kind of secular education that you received, the prayers you recited at school, and you know how that conditioned you for life in the Foreign Service later. And your choice of the Foreign Service, why you elected to go into the Foreign Service, it's so different from what you encounter these days. You speak of meeting a young Foreign Service officer many years later, and how that particular young man was number 600 in the merit list, and had no choice but to join the Foreign Service, whereas in your time and in my time, it was, the top ranked people who entered the Foreign Service. Be that as it may, it's not that we wanted a meritocracy, but I'm just saying the kind of outlook with which we perceived the Foreign Service at that time, and the contributions of our first Prime Minister, Mr. Nehru, to that whole universe of understanding about what diplomacy is all about. So I'd like you to speak a little about that, and how would you define your true calling? You went on from being a diplomat to becoming a politician, but looking back on your life, what was your true calling? How would you define that?
I think I was 6 years old when Jawaharlal Nehru became the Prime Minister of India. And I was 23 years old when he passed away. So for the most important 17 years of my growing up, it was under the shadow of a very great man called Jawaharlal Nehru. And although I've learned much more about him after I ceased being 23 years old, the impact that his thinking, that his vision, that his idea of India had on my generation was so powerful that we became Nehruvians at that stage and learned what it is that is unique to our civilization. How is it that we have become one country? What does it take to keep this country together? And what are the dangers, what are the fault lines that we have to keep in mind? And above all, we learned that India was never a country of one philosophical or religious belief, that it was a country which always had an open mind, that we didn't even have really a proper name for our religion, although subsequently it has been called the Sanatana Dharma. But at that time, it was a congeries of beliefs. And Nehru talks about how the Rig Veda has this verse where he says, who created all this? After describing the mountains and the trees and the beauties of nature, the poet asks, who created all this? And he gives the tentative answer that only he knows. And then comes the next punchline, which is, and perhaps even he knows not. So it's this basic skepticism in Indian thinking that enabled us to keep our eyes and mind and ears open to whatever came from outside. And instead of succumbing to those influences or rejecting it completely, we assimilated, we synthesized, and we made whatever we liked in it part of our own, with the result that the India of today is the consequence of thousands, perhaps 5,000 years of history, and that therefore the authentic Indian is the Indian who understands the flow of our history, which I think Mahatma Gandhi summed up beautifully when he says, I do not want the windows of my house to be stuffed, and the doors closed. I want the winds of all the world to blow about my house. But, he added, I refuse to be blown off my feet by any of them. So you're an Indian because you're open. And I think that is what I learned from Jawaharlal Nehru, and that is the philosophy that has informed the whole of my
Mani,
life.
let's come back to Nehru and you. How do you meet what happens? So, you know, when you're about to join, you've been selected for the Indian Foreign Service, but suddenly there's a big problem and they won't let you in through that door, hallowed door, because they find out that you have dallied with Marxists in Cambridge. And there's a question mark on you. So let me just read this bit where you say how you finally had to go through convincing all of them. And Nehru it was, who finally signed off on you saying that let him in.
Yeah, well, it's a story I'd rather tell than read.
Yes, please read. Please tell.
When I was at St. Stephen's, the early beginnings of leftist thinking became really hardened because I came under the influence of several friends who were much better, who were older than me, better educated than me, more involved with Marxism than I was. And I came out of St. Stephen's College blood red. And so when I got to Cambridge, I asked for special tutorials with a very well-known Marxist analyst called Maurice Daub. And he kindly agreed to meet me every Thursday for a glass of sherry. And there I discovered that all the questions I had in my mind, he was not able to answer. And the answers he gave were frankly quite rubbish. And so I stopped those tutorials. And then I came across a book by a lady called Claire Sheridan. She was the first cousin of Winston Churchill. And she wrote a book called To the Four Winds. It was her memoirs. And in that, she describes how in 1919, Comrade Kamenev came from Moscow to London, and talking to him, he said, why don't you come across and see my country? So there was a scandal because Winston Churchill's first cousin was going all the way to Moscow to see that land which was being described by the British aristocracy as an absolute hellhole. And she was a sculptor, so she sculpted the heads of all the leaders of the revolution. And she has beautiful profiles about each of them. But clearly her favorite was Leon Trotsky. And when she finishes her 3 years in Moscow, he invites her to tea. And she describes this beautiful silverware in which the tea was being served, and the cucumber sandwiches with watercress on them. And when Trotsky comes in to join her, she gushes. She said, Comrade Trotsky, I just don't believe all the horrible things that they say about you. At which point, Trotsky pulls out a pistol, puts it at her temple, and says that if I thought you could harm our revolution one whit, I'd shoot you dead on the spot. And then he returns the pistol to his pocket and says, as you do not matter, would you like to have another sandwich? I said to myself, I couldn't eat fish in Hall because when I looked at the beady eye of the trout, I didn't know how to skin this thing. So I used to walk out of eating fish in Hall. And so I said, where am I going to be a revolutionary when I can't even skin a dead trout? So at that point, I had really ceased being. I was very disillusioned with this. But the Indian Intelligence Service, and I don't know why it's called the Intelligence Service, because it's the one quality they lack. And they cottoned on to me for some reason, because I was very prominent in the politics of Cambridge Union. And they then damned me. I'd passed the exam not as well as Nirupama did, but I passed it fairly well. And I had been declared, because I was within the first 10. In those days, they used to read the 10 names out on All India Radio. And so there was official confirmation that I was in the Foreign Service, but I wasn't getting an appointment letter. So then suddenly, I received, while on holiday in Norway, a telegram which said that you've been rejected from all services. So I rushed back to India and then began my great odyssey to try to get into the service. And I think what you were pointing to was that after a period of 3 or 4 months, I had gone to see a friend of mine called Arvind Pandey, who was at Cambridge with me. And I was so down in the dumps because nothing was happening, although many promises were being made to me. And Arvind said that the Special Secretary Home, a very well-known civil servant called L.P. Singh, had come to dinner the previous night. And on learning that Arvind and I had been at school since the age of 11, he apparently asked, why doesn't this chap come to see me? So at that, as he was telling me, this B.D. Pandey, the father, walked in and said, tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock, you must go to South Block and meet with Mr. L.P. Singh. Now, my mother, she could never say Marxist. She used to say Marxist. And all she understood of communism was that it had resulted in my wearing jeans. So she forced me to go to a clothing shop called Lafan's in Connaught Place in Delhi. And I had to outfit myself in a raw silk jacket and white trousers with clear creases. And Amma would give me a white shirt to wear. And I used to wrap up a tie and put it in the pocket and put on this bourgeois pretension when I went in for my interviews. So I walked into L.P. Singh's room. He's a big bear of a man with a huge cigar in his hands and a tiny room with a very big table. So he looked at me and he said, Aiyar, sit down. So I sat down. He said, I don't want you to regard yourself as a prisoner in the dock. So I said, thank you, sir. And he said, I just got a few questions to ask you. And he asked me a few questions. And suddenly I found myself in a huge argument with L.P. Singh. And the argument was over what is the real meaning of democracy. And I made the argument that a 14th belted earl who'd still not taken off his ermine had been made by Macmillan's order the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And I said, is that a democracy? Whereas I said, if Gamal Abdel Nasser were to hold an election, he would get 95% of the vote. That was just the wrong thing to say, because L.P. Singh then said to me, I've only ever been abroad once in my life. That was to the United States. And on my way back, I stopped off with Ambassador Apa Pant in Cairo. And that night, Nasser rounded up all the Copts, and he either had them jailed or hanged or exiled. I said, how do you call it a democracy? I went completely berserk at that point. I said to him, sir, you began this conversation by telling me that I was not to regard myself as a prisoner in the dock. But a prisoner is given 3 privileges which are being denied to me. So L.P. Singh said, what are those? I said, first, he's assumed innocent until proved guilty. You're asking me to prove my innocence. Second, I said, he's told what the charges against him are. And nobody's told me what the charges against me are. So I don't know what I'm defending myself against. And third, I said, if he can't afford an attorney, he's provided one by the court. And I said, you're not even allowing me to call my witnesses.
Okay, I'm going to stop
and
you.
LP looked at me.
No, 1 minute, I'm going to read this.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah. So LP looks at him. Exhausted at my own temerity, I slumped back in my seat.
Put up your mic.
Yeah. Exhausted at my own temerity, that's him, I slumped back in my seat. The special secretary pulled the cigar out of his mouth and barked, Aiyar, you are in, now out.
And then 2 weeks later, there was I managed to get to see, thanks to one foreign secretary who succeeded her, or did he? Shankar. He preceded you. Shankar Menon, when I was a minister, showed me my file, which I was not allowed to see. And there I saw that the Home Minister had finally recommended, he'd overruled the Intelligence Bureau and said that I should be taken into the service. And the last entry on that file reads as follows. I'm speaking from memory, but the words are exact. It said, I agree. I too have heard good reports of Mani Shankar Aiyar. He may be taken into the Indian Foreign Service and sent to Missouri for his training. Signed, J. Nehru, 23 October 1963.
Yeah.
So that trauma was well worth living through to be sent into diplomacy under the personal hand of the greatest Indian, or at least the second greatest Indian of the 20th century.
Mani, years later, when I was doing a Follow the Leader episode during an election in Mailathadurai with you,
And if
for
I may
NDTV.
just come in here,
Yeah.
I think Ambassador Chandrasekhar Dasgupta had
Oh,
the
yes.
last word on this. Why-
Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, who was my closest friend from college and into the service and so forth, he really had the last word. He said they let you in because they thought you were a Marxist, but of the Groucho variety.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
That was a good one, yeah. But years later, I meet him in Mailathadurai. I'm chasing him for 24/7 episode on Follow the Leader for NDTV. And during the course of the day, going to various venues, we enter the CPM office. And you sort of salute Lenin, Marx, everything. And I said, Mani, you're a closet commie. And you said, maybe I am. So that was our personal, yeah. I want to move to the chapters because, you know, it's 350 pages long and we need to move quickly now if we want to cover ground. Nirupama, I want you to take us through the next, you know, this rapid when he gets into the Foreign Service and he joins in Brussels, then to Hanoi, Baghdad. I mean, this mad race through these countries. What comes through to you in those chapters? What is it that you would like to ask him? And
Well, I think it just tells you, and especially to the uninitiated, who have this impression of a diplomat's life being all about cocktails and chandeliers. And if you read this memoir, you'll understand just the scenes from a diplomat's life, you know, the contrasts, the different situations you're placed in. It might well be that you study French in Brussels and it all seems so far removed from life in India. But then you're posted in Hanoi in the midst of the Vietnam War, and you know you see the way Vietnamese on bicycles take on the might of the Americans and triumph in the end. And then you're in Baghdad, and I thought it was hilarious the way you described the duties of the head of Chancery and the kind of diplomatic notes you had to send out asking for 1 kilo of chicken and half a kilo of mutton and keeping accounts. And then later, much later, you're in Pakistan. You're a Consul General in Karachi, and you reopened the Consulate General, which had been closed since 1965, and you go there at the end of 1978, and you spent 3 eventful years there. And I think what really blew me away about that chapter was the manner in which you were able to express what the quintessence of our problems with Pakistan are, and where we as a country have perhaps
Can we come
failed.
to that later?
Yeah.
Because I want to take you through life as a diplomat,
yes.
at least as I saw it. It began in Missouri, with the director of the academy calling the 16 of us who belonged to the Foreign Service together for the first time. We'd never been chosen out. And we were all very proud. We walked in, and Mr. Datta said, I don't know what the Foreign Service does. He says, all I know is that you have to attend a lot of cocktail parties. And so I want to give you a piece of advice. And he said, before you go to a cocktail party, just drink a spoonful of olive oil so that you don't make a fool of yourself. It was the most useful training that I ever received in the Foreign Service. I then got to Brussels, where I had a very colorful ambassador, an ICS officer called KB Lal. And he put me, almost immediately as I got there, on the job of establishing the India-Luxembourg Friendship Society. It took about a year before we could set it up. But when we did, I had made an arrangement with the leading Luxembourg newspaper for them to publish on the morning of the evening where the society was going to be inaugurated, to publish a message from the President of India. And we wrote to Rashtrapati Bhavan saying, would you please just list out, I think there's somebody coming in. So the editor of the Luxemburger Wort, he said to me that so long as you bring the message in by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'll certainly publish it as a box item on the front page of Luxembourg's leading newspaper. So it was 12 o'clock in Brussels, and no message had come from the President of India. And I was in a state because I knew it would take me about 3 hours to drive from Brussels to Luxembourg. So I went in to see KB Lal, and I said, sir, the message hasn't come. He said, of course it has. So I said, really, where is it? He says, मैं क्या जानूं? तुम लिखो. I looked at him in horror. I said, मैं लिखूं? He says, आखिर तुम्हारे जैसे कोई बाबू ही तो वहाँ लिखेगा, तो तुम ही जाकर लिखो. So I went out and I wrote the greatest piece of prose that Radhakrishnan ever wrote. And I took it back to the ambassador, who had 2 words which he only ever used with me twice. It was his highest compliment. He looked at it, he read it, and he said, "Khoob, bahut khoob." Tab jao. So then I jumped into my car, I rushed in, I reached Luxembourg with 15 minutes to spare, and I got into the Luxembourg Wort office. I gave them the message, and next morning, I bought 10 copies of the newspaper to see my handiwork, my first great achievement as a diplomat. And there it was on the front page. I then went to a department store.
Mani, you can't give away your whole book like this.
No, let me
tell you. No. I won't allow you. We've got half an hour to go, and there's a lot of ground to cover. Sorry. They also need to buy the book, and they need to read all these amazing chapters. I am going now, jumping to chapter 9. Don't be a Groucho Marx on me. Chapter 9 is the icing on the cake in this memoir, undoubtedly. I know former diplomats have been messaging me from last night saying we're reading this, and, former intelligence people. Anyway, this is a really wonderful chapter. Don't be angry, Mani. Oops.
No, you dropped me from my punchline.
No, now you're coming.
And so many.
That's true. I think you should allow him to complete it.
So many punchlines in this book. Okay, 2 minutes. I'm clocking you.
And then go to Pakistan.
Okay.
But in those 2 minutes, I want to tell you that I went into the department store and I got a telephone call from the first secretary in the embassy saying the real message has come. And I was absolutely horrified because I've just told you the story of my great difficulty in getting in. And here I was caught out in forging the signature of the President of India. So I rang KB Lal in a complete panic. And I said to him, "Sir, the real message has arrived." And he says, "Tum kuch bhi samajhte nahi ho." The President of India is so keen on Luxembourg that he has sent 2 messages. The one that you've had published in a language which nobody in India understands, and the other message which I'll read out this evening. Now you can go to Pakistan.
See, now he's given the punchline away, and now you guys won't buy the book. I was trying to be crafty and keep the punchline. Okay. Anyway, now we go to icing on the cake, chapter 9, where He's posted between 78 to 82 to Karachi. Okay, what does this man do there? First of all, brick and mortar of this dilapidated consul office. Because you know, Pakistan consulate has just reopened again after how many years of it being closed?
13 years.
Okay, 13 years.
13 years of neglect.
13 years. And then he goes on to this, he says we have to issue visas to the people, people-to-people contact. 3 lakh visas in your entire range. I want you to talk about that chapter. That was amazing.
Well, what was clear to me was the importance which people in Karachi attached to the visa office, the Indian visa office. When in the Sun newspaper, on the left-hand side, the headline read, Supreme Court confirms hanging of Bhutto. And the right-hand lead story was, visa office to open shortly, Aiyar. So the Pakistanis were either wanting to see their former prime minister hanged or to get a visa to get the hell out of the country. And that is what persuaded me that we must handle what happens. And the day we opened, there were 5,000 people who surrounded the consulate in concentric circles. So the only way I could think of getting them to go away was to say that I have a capacity of handling 300 visas a day, so we will stamp the visa application form with a date. And if you come between 9 and 10 on the morning of the date on your application form, we'll take your passport, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, if you come between 4 and 5, we'll return it with a visa. And when we were going to reach 1 lakh visas, and let me finish that story. When we were going to reach 1 lakh visas, and it reached 99,990, I called 10 Pakistani journalists into our side of where we had a windows where we would hand out the passports. And I asked these Pakistani journalists to act as my visa clerks. And when we got to the 100,000th visa, and the Pakistani journalist handed it over, I presented the chap with a tin of Darjeeling tea and forgave him his visa fees. At which point, suddenly slogans started. And the slogans were, Hindustan ke Consul General, Zindabad, Zindabad. Yahan koi pabandi nahi, yahan koi rishwat nahi. Pakistanis. It completely altered my view of what our neighbors are like. They love us, and we hate them. I regard the Pakistani people as our biggest asset. And I condemn our Foreign Office for knowing everything we need to know about how to handle Paraguay and being completely at sea when it comes to Pakistan.
I think you put it very succinctly. I think you say it very succinctly in the book. You say, what is this? Can somebody please? The simple truth is...
Can you just take the mic near your mouth?
The simple truth is that terrorists do not apply for visas, he writes in the book, nor do smugglers. We target quite the wrong audience when we wield the visa as a weapon of revenge. I think it's really...
And I'd like to also, if I may, I think this passage summed it all up. Pakistan is an ineradicable reality, and Pakistanis of every hue will fight to retain their new Medina. Equally, as I wrote in my farewell dispatch from Karachi, the general populace will respond with the greatest outpouring of generosity to a blitzkrieg of goodwill from our side. Pakistan is not going away. We can huff and we can puff, but that's not going to blow the house down. And I reluctantly conclude that the lobby for peace is far larger in Pakistan than it is in India.
Yep.
But Mani, this is a one-actor, one-act play put up by you. No takers in the government since then. and of course the present times.
Yeah, it was Mani Dikshit, who was one of her predecessors by several generations, who described my description of Pakistan and Pakistanis as a Pollyanna view of that country. But while I have reflected on his comment that I have a Pollyanna view, I find that when remarks are made like talks and terror can't go together, for 9 years is our policy to Pakistan. So has that resulted in terror ending? If it has, why don't we talk? And if it hasn't, then surely it's time we rethought our foreign policy in terms of some alternative cliche. The fact of the matter is, and here I really underline it as a serious point, that so long as we don't know how to handle Pakistan, it will remain an albatross around our necks. You can't become a Vishwaguru if you do not know how to handle a small neighbor on your borders. And who are we to make peace in Ukraine when we don't know how to make peace at Wagah Atari? So we need to understand that with the goodwill of the Pakistani people and firm talking to the Pakistani establishment, we should be able to arrive at a via media for what else is diplomacy about. If we can't, if you have the courage to conduct surgical strikes against them, why don't you have the guts to sit across a table and talk to them? Now, Nirupama will tell you of the awful experience she had when we went to negotiate with the Pakistanis with Mr. S.M. Krishna. He's a well-known Karnataka man. He was the foreign minister, she was the foreign secretary, and they treated her extremely badly. But she knows that in diplomacy, you have to persist. You ought to have patience in order to be able to arrive at a solution. Over to you.
Yeah. Well, that particular episode had the villain of the piece, if I may say, was Shah Mahmood Qureshi, who was the foreign minister of Pakistan at that time. And he had somehow got it into his head that talks without talking about Siachen would not get anywhere. And it was obvious that he was, being goaded to persist with that line. And the whole dialogue fell apart because of that, because obviously we wanted to talk about trade, yeah. We wanted to talk about visas, we wanted to talk about opening up communication as the first steps to normalization. And that's where somehow you mentioned that there is goodwill on the Pakistani side, but the Pakistani establishment obviously labors under a lot of these complexes, may I say, when it comes to approaching India, and it was never easy dealing with them.
But at the same time, if we did talk Siachen, if you did talk Kashmir, as Dr. Manmohan Singh did, he got Sati Lamba, whom we both know, to function on the back channel, and they did not talk about visas and films or trade and that sort of thing. They talked about Kashmir, and they almost arrived at an agreement.
What was that agreement? Can you sort of detail that?
It was a 4-point agreement. Yeah. The first point of which was that there is no question of independence for Kashmir. So the Pakistanis agreed with us that the call for Azadi in Kashmir is a call that neither of us is ready to accept. The second was that we will isolate the people of Kashmir from the Indian-Pakistan dispute on the status of Jammu and Kashmir by allowing them to cross the ceasefire line in Kashmir and meet with their relatives, their friends, and undertake a level of barter trade and be able to run things together. The third was that there would be the same level of democracy in Pakistani Kashmir or Pakistan-held Kashmir as there would be in Indian Kashmir. The same level of representativeness in the running of governance. And the fourth point, on which there was some little disagreement and would have been sorted out if Dr. Manmohan Singh had succeeded in going to Islamabad before Musharraf's government fell into difficulty was that they said we'll have a cooperative mechanism, and we said that we'll have a joint mechanism to supervise the implementation of the accord. And this was given the name 4-point formula by General Pervez Musharraf. And we showed that if you grapple with the hard problem, now Mr. Krishna was not willing to talk Siachen, but Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was. And he has said in an interview, which is published in Sunday of the 12th to 18th August 1990, this was after he ceased being Prime Minister and before he was killed, that he'd almost arrived at an agreement with Zia on Siachen. And he said it couldn't take place under Benazir because his experience was that it was easier to deal with a hawk who had a strong government behind him than to deal with somebody who did not have a strong government behind her. And that was why Siachen did not get solved a decade or more before you had that unhappy experience. In fact, Shah Mahmud Qureshi is a very close friend of mine. And he happened to be in India when that terrorist attack in Mumbai took place. And he'd asked me to meet with me separately. Then I was told not to talk to him. So then I spoke to the High Commissioner, and he was begging me to allow that deputy chief of the ISI to come to Delhi to meet with our authorities. And he said he himself, as foreign minister, would accompany them. And it was we who said no. And if you read Ghare Khan's book, Centers of Power, he was one of the best foreign service officers we had. But he has a long description of how G. Parthasarathi, P.N. Haksar, P.C. Alexander, M. Rasgotra were all, and Sharda Prasad, were all competing with each other to prepare a draft treaty of peace with Pakistan, which would be so drafted that the Pakistanis would be compelled to reject it. Now I can understand all these people, these wise old men, spending time trying to prepare a draft which would be accepted by the other side. But it shows where our foreign policy goes wrong. We spend so much time drafting a treaty in the hope that it will be rejected.
I think Mr. Jaswant Singh, the late Mr. Jaswant Singh, had something quite, I think, relevant to this discussion we are having today. After the Agra summit had failed, he saw me in the corridor and he took me aside and he said, "Nirupama, so many midwives, but the baby was stillborn." So I think with Pakistan and India-Pakistan relations, that often happens. But you have a line here: sustaining distrust between governments is easier than the patient building of trust between people.
That's true. It's a chicken and egg situation. Yeah. If you have distrust between the governments, how can you have genuine trust among the people? At the same time, unless there's genuine trust among the people, how do you overcome distrust among governments? So my solution to this is that we should have, please note the words, an uninterrupted and uninterruptible dialogue with Pakistan until we come to a solution. And a solution is feasible, as demonstrated in Dr. Manmohan Singh's time. So you have to talk. Otherwise, you have to go to war. And if war is an option that both sides rule out, and talking is the only thing we can do, then what do we gain by not talking?
I think all three of us
as
seated
Sahil
here.
Ludhianvi once said, you have to keep the lights on in both our houses.
Totally. I think all three of us seated here, I've also traveled extensively in Pakistan to make a film on the impact of satellite TV in South Asia, right from northwest frontier province to all the five, Karachi, Lahore, Peshawar, etc. And I absolutely reflect the sentiments that you say, that people to people, these contacts have to be continued. We cannot close the doors. We three are diehard, dreamers, diehard romantics about the concept of South Asia. But is that a dream that is lost in the neighborhood?
I always remember what Lakshman Kadirgamar used to say, the assassinated foreign minister of Sri Lanka. He would say South Asia is meant to be an integer. But the way it is today, that definition hardly applies. There is no integration. There is hardly any regional trade. There are no you remember the Grand Trunk Road and the way it connected Kabul to, literally the east coast of India. Where is all that gone?
SARC is dead.
We have forgotten what it is to dream. I think
it's awful that the 5 icons of India's youth, Salman Khan, Amir Ali Khan, Shah Rukh Khan, Saif Ali Khan, and there's one more, have all been told, go to Pakistan. Why do they say go to Pakistan? Why don't they say go to...
They've told you also, Mani, several times, go to Pakistan.
Oh, I've been told all the time to go to Pakistan. But these people, they are icons of our youth. They're told go to Pakistan. No one says go to Saudi Arabia. No one says go to Bangladesh. No one says go to Indonesia. Why? Because the relationship of our government with Islamic countries is very good. It's only with Pakistan that it is as bad as it is. And I think now increasingly, Pakistan and Pakistanis are being used as dog whistles to indicate the Indian Muslim. And it is difficult to target the Indian Muslim if you are making friends with Pakistan. And I therefore fear that as distinct from our time together in the Foreign Service, when Pakistan was a foreign policy issue, it has now become, and is increasingly becoming, a domestic issue. And that you cannot make good relations with Pakistan unless you're a secular India. That is the bottom line. And if you drift away from secularism, then it becomes that much more difficult to reconcile yourself to the existence of Pakistan, which came into existence by rejecting the notion of Muslims and Hindus living together. So we need to keep Pakistan as a foreign policy issue, and we need to respect the Indian Muslim as part and parcel and a valuable part of ourselves.
I agree.
I hope you will go to Lahore and Karachi with your book. I'm sure they'll welcome you back.
Well, I have been invited to the Fairs Festival in Lahore,
yes.
so I'll be there in February.
Yeah. Well, we must sadly leave this very, very rich chapter 9 on Pakistan, but do pick up a copy of the book and do read it. It's just incredible how there's one part which is so funny where they sort of start rallying behind you, almost thinking that you are Bhutto. But I'm not going to give all that away because it's all there, these amazing. Let's move now to the chapter on the Delhi interring. Okay, so now we're entering a very dark phase. You've come back to India and the Sikh riots have happened. And you are saying that, oh my God, this government, I'm not going to vote for this Congress government that comes to power, is going to contest.
That's true. I've deliberately avoided the word Sikh riots because it would imply that the Sikhs on their part were also rioting. Actually, it was a Sikh pogrom.
Yeah.
And the pogrom involved the death of some 3,000 innocent Sikhs in a period of just under 72 hours. And at that time, we had a home minister who was easily the second most important minister in Indira Gandhi's government. And he was the home minister of India. We had an LG who was an ICS officer of very high reputation, a gentleman called S.L. Khurana, and a new Indian Airlines Prime Minister. I was horrified that we were picking on an Indian Airlines pilot to pilot this country, this huge, diverse and difficult country. And it seemed as if he was totally incompetent when this pogrom broke out, and the government was more or less paralyzed. But then I learnt later, very much later, that after seeing that the Home Minister was not rising to the occasion, Rajiv Gandhi got into his car. He went to the worst affected areas, driving himself during the middle of the night and with very little security, and then came to the conclusion that the Indian Army must be brought in. So I always wondered why the Indian Army was not brought in. Then years later, I met Major General Jamwal, who was heading the Indian troops in Delhi cantonment. And he said that as a matter of policy, to prevent a military coup d'etat, the force in Delhi cantonment is always kept at a very low level so that they don't conduct a sudden coup in the middle of the night. And that the police, that their instructions were that if you're called upon, you should bring in the troops from Meerut. But because the orders for bringing in the troops from Meerut was not issued by the Home Minister, but by the Prime Minister of India, 2 precious days were lost. But on the 3rd day, there was a flag march, and the rioting or the killing came to an end. It came to an end within 72 hours. But the performance of the government was so horrific that I decided, I was not in PMO at the time, I decided that as a citizen of India, I would vote against Rajiv Gandhi. That vote did not get cast because when I got to the voting booth, I found my name was not on the voters list. So I couldn't vote. But I have made it clear to Rajiv personally and to his wife more recently that it was every intention of mine to not vote for the Congress party. My problem was that in Delhi, the only alternative to the Congress at that time was the BJP. And I was never in my life going to vote for the BJP. So it was just as well that the good Lord arranged for my name not to be on the voters list.
And yet you go on to join the PMO and become one of his trusted aides. The photographs here, some of them, like literally you look like lovers, your eyes locked into each other. And yet you are saying that you were just the manager of his travel and tour company. And the media, of course, had a go at you, although they meant to have a go at Rajiv Gandhi. And Veer Sanghvi calls you a lightning rod. You took away all that. So,
you see, I was his manager, tours and travels. So that meant that every time he was out of Delhi, I would be with him all over the country. And of course, the cameras were on. And I would frequently be seen with him. So this gave a completely wrong impression, including to people like Nafis Fazal, who's sitting in the front row, that I was very close to Rajiv. I wasn't. I was a bureaucrat. I was a civil servant. I was at his beck and call. He then, at the end of his first year, he made me his speechwriter. So I was always present when he was making a public speech. And the media were also present whenever he was making a public speech. And they would look at the front row, they'd see me sitting there and say, aha, Aiyar is back. And then they made the connection that, oh, Aiyar was at Doon School, Rajiv was at Doon School. But the fact of the matter is that he was 3 years junior to me in a school where you were for 5 years.
tell them about the swimming pool episode, the only time you encountered him.
He was far too junior to me, and it was a school in which no one gave a toss that the Prime Minister's grandson was in the school. So there was a rule in the school that if you had done your senior Cambridge exam and were designated a senior, then you could swim in the pool at any time you wanted. But if you were a junior, as Rajiv was, then he had to take the permission of a senior to swim. So the only memory I have of Rajiv at school is this very shy 14-year-old boy walking up to me and saying, Yar, give us permission to swim, Yar. Now, the usual thing a Doon School senior says is a word that I can't use in this mixed company, but it begins with F. So I should have said F off to him. But instead of that, I very graciously gave him permission. And I've often wondered whether if I'd done the usual Doon School thing and told him not to, that I wouldn't give permission to swim, whether I'd have ever got into PMO. The fact is that he was much too junior to me, and when we were at Cambridge together, he belonged to the rich set. I mean, he was taking Sonia to all the best restaurants in town, whereas I was desperately making girlfriends because they would cook for me. I had penury, he had riches, where it was an uncrossable bridge. So it was only after I came into his office that I started having an official relationship with him. I think many of you would be astonished to learn that I never called him anything but sir. And the only time he came to my home was when my mother died. And he never called me to his home. And I think Sonia would have been horrified if he had called me in. So it was an official relationship, but it was an official relationship that was played out in the public eye. And then he got this idea about Panchayati Raj. And Mr. D.R. Patil and Mr. Ramaswamy, Narayan Swamy, and Ghorpade, they're all here, my Panchayati Raj companions in Karnataka, and they know how they are as impassioned as I am on the subject. And he found that nobody in his office, not Monte Kaluwalia, not Gopi Arora, not Radhan Sen, not Pulak Chatterjee, was interested in this subject. And here I was as a Foreign Service officer, passionately involved with local government. So on local government, I not only worked very closely with Rajiv, but was often made his envoy to go and meet opposition chief ministers, to meet congressmen who were dissidents, to bring Congress ministers onto the side of giving reservations for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and above all, for giving reservations for women. And all this meant that I had a very public profile. So my IAS neighbor, when he saw a photograph of me addressing the Congress Working Committee, he said that you're finished. And I knew I was. Had I ever gone back to the Foreign Service, I would have been branded a Rajiv man, a politicized Rajiv man. And he did it to one of my friends in the Foreign Service, a man called G. Parthasarathi, who stayed on, and therefore VP Singh sent him as our High Commissioner to Cyprus. And I said that was the greatest decision that VP Singh ever made, sending half a man to half a country.
Mani bitchy at his best. Mani also very cheeky. Please tell them that story. He refuses to read because he says, I know my book upside down. But it's amazing, this read, where you just make up something about whether Rajiv Gandhi is an atheist or he believes in God. You want to say it?
Or what does Rajiv read in bed?
No, this is the one about God. Let me read it with your
permission.
permission.
That one.
Okay, let me read it.
Yeah, sure,
you take
sure.
a break now. Late that night at about 10 p.m., I'm sort of starting in the middle, while I was finishing up at PMO, Nandan rang to say, Nandan's the editor of a paper, rang to say he had forgotten to ask one key question. Did the Prime Minister believe in God? I replied that it was far too late in the night to trouble the PM, but I was certain he didn't because he was a modern, rational, intelligent man. Next morning, as the engines were revving up, I went into the PM's cabin and informed him of the answer I had given. He was astonished, but I do believe in God, he exclaimed. I rushed into the cockpit and demanded to be connected to the tower. Someone come on the line. And I asked him, someone did come on the line, and I asked him to take down Nandan's number and convey my urgent message. Rajiv Gandhi believes in God.
And the plane took off.
I mean, you're like, at moments, self-effacing, at times so arrogant. You talk about how the Indian media pillories you. Actually, they mean to attack Rajiv Gandhi, but you get pilloried. In Pakistan, the media there adores you because of what you did to the people. What's your relation with the media? And how has it been even till date?
This is where I wanted
Yes,
to,
please.
he says, some journalist had asked me what Rajiv Gandhi read in bed, and I had answered, how would I know? I'm not there with him.
And then I tell the
Yeah,
story
and then you-
of how I was summoned by Makhanlal Photedar, who was Rajiv Gandhi's political secretary. And fortunately, as I walked into the office, he was on the telephone. It was a very long call. So I didn't know why he had sent for me, but I looked across the table and found that he had highlighted some sentences which told the story of how somebody had asked me, what does Rajiv read in bed? And I said, how would I know? I'm not there with him. So then Photedar put the phone down and stared at me and said, ye kya hai? So I said, chi, saab. Kya gande cheez ye journalist likhte hai? I got myself off the hook.
Look at these politicians and what they do to the media. Apologize, Mani.
But then on the other hand, the media just loved hitting out at me. And they still do.
They do.
So it's okay. I have a very tangled relationship with the media. But as a result of that, some like Nupur Basu love me.
Oh.
And others like Tavleen Singh hate me. So it's okay. You pick up the daisy, you pull out one petal, says, does she love me? Then you pick up the next, does she love me not? So the media is like that. There are some nice people in it, and there are some awful people in it. And the awful people, their names begin with A and continue with G, and they speak on a channel that begins with R. Now, add the dots together.
We promised we would not talk about certain individuals. Let's stay with that. You talked about Sonia. She was there for your launch. So although the party has kept you in the doghouse, she's there at your book launch in Delhi. What's going on? I think the Congress party, the Gandhi family love you privately, but want to shun you publicly. Why, Mani?
I think because of the media. The media picks on any sentence I say, twist it, and then blame me for it. And on this recent remark that I made about P.V. Narasimha Rao, they've picked it up, and they're trying to say repeatedly, the Godi media, that these are not Mani Shankar Aiyar's words. Please remember, he is a Mukut Mani of the Gandhi family. And what he is saying is the real views of the Gandhi family. So they use me in order to attack the Gandhis. And I think that's a very unfair thing to do, not to me, because after all, if I was not connected to the Gandhi family, do you think this group would have been here? So I know that I've been pushed up by my connection to the family. But these are my views, and they are not mavericks. They are serious politicians. I am in it for the fun of it, and boy, have I not had fun.
So you've given, you go on to give Rajiv Gandhi almost a clean chit on what happened in 1984, what happens in Babri Masjid, and also, what was the third?
Shah Banu.
The Shah Banu case.
And
kind of. And Bofors. What is it that made you do that? And hope you're going to have more evidence to support what you're saying in the next sequel. And tell us about the next sequel.
You'll have to wait for the next book, because in my original manuscript, my description of Rajiv Gandhi as a prime minister, because I was not a witness to it, I was not a participant in it, I was never a confidant of his, it reads like biography, not like an autobiography. And so with great difficulty, my publisher was persuaded to take all those pages out and write it up as a separate book. That separate book has the title, The Rajiv I Knew, and Why He Was India's Most Misunderstood Prime Minister. Just before coming to Bangalore, I have handed in the final manuscript of that book, and I think it should be out in 2 or 3 months' time, unless we have complications with early elections. I then don't know what will happen to the book. But in that book, I've gone into it in very great detail. And I don't want to preempt your reading, whether you read this book or not. I do hope all of you will read the next book, because there I have laid out the argument in detail with respect to the 3 or 4 points that you raised, and I'm answering it in 1 sentence each or 2 sentences. On the Sikhs, while I have faulted him in my book for at least 4 mistakes. One, I said he should have immediately apologized. The apology came more than 10 years later from a Congress Sikh Prime Minister. The second thing I said he did wrong was that he did not dismiss the Commissioner of Delhi Police, who happened to be a first cousin of his, Gautam Kaul. He dismissed Kaul about 1.5 years later, but it was too late to do it then. Third, I said that he made a huge mistake in not announcing a judicial inquiry immediately. He announced it 6 months later, but it was too late by then. So I have a number of criticisms to make of him. But I then describe how he went to Hussainiwala, the same Hussainiwala that Mr. Modi turned away from. He went at a time when his mother's body was still cold, because it's just 3 months later, 6 months later. And he went there, and he reached out to the Sikhs, and he arrived at the Longowal Accord, which eventually brought peace to Punjab. So while perhaps his speech was inadequate, his actions were right. And we would not have Punjab as an integral part of a peaceful India today if it had not been for the initiatives that he took. So you can fault him for not speaking on time, but you can't fault him for not acting on time. Insofar as Sri Lanka is concerned, there's nothing about it in this book, although I did have a longish passage about it. I was very critical, but I've quoted, I'm taking a peek into the next volume, I've just been very critical of the whole misadventure, and then quoted Mani Dikshit, the Foreign Secretary, who says that every agency of the government of India, the intelligence agency, the diplomats, the political system, the military above all failed him. And therefore, you might say it was a collective failure of the Indian establishment, although since he was Prime Minister, he has to take the responsibility for it. With regard to Shah
And he
Bagh,
paid for it with his life.
he paid for it with his life. Insofar as Shah Bano is concerned, I want to sum up the whole controversy by pointing out that there were 2 Supreme Court judgments on Shah Bano. The 1985 one is the one everyone has heard about. But for some reason, even my favorite lovers, the media, have simply not highlighted the 2001 judgment of the same Supreme Court, who said that far from reversing the judgment that had been passed by the Supreme Court on Shah Bano, one woman, Rajiv Gandhi incorporated all the best features of Muslim personal law in the civil law of India through the Muslim Women's Protection on Divorce Act, and he made the executing responsibility not that of the mullah, in the village. It became the responsibility of the state Waqf board. And if they didn't look after the woman who was penurious, then the Waqf board would be hauled up by the magistrate. Now that is the 2001 judgment, where he says that no article of the Constitution was contravened, that no law was contravened, that no fundamental right of Shah Bano was contravened. And for some strange reason, this 2001 judgment, under which all Muslim women's divorces cases have been decided for the last 20 years is not in the public domain, but the 1985 judgment is always in the public domain. If you believe that the 85 judgment should be implemented, you have to believe that the 2001 judgment of the same Supreme Court is also to be implemented. As far as Bofors is concerned, all the lies that were told, and I've dealt with them in detail, all the lies that were told went before the Delhi High Court, and Justice Kapoor pronounced that there is not a scintilla of evidence against Rajiv Gandhi. And then it was taken up once more by another Delhi High Court judge, R.S. Sodhi, and he said that there is absolutely nothing to indicate that any bribes were paid. And when the current government came into office, they went in appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court time-barred it, said that you've taken 4,522 days to investigate this case, and you've produced nothing, not even in your petitions. So this man, this wonderful man, has been pilloried by people who just love leaked documents.
So former diplomat Mani Shankar Aiyar, in his own words, becomes spare tire in the PMO, then convinces Rajiv Gandhi to give him a seat in Mayilathadurai. You are in the thick of your first campaign in Mayilathadurai. And at 10:30 at night, 10:40 or so, you get to hear about that your leader has been assassinated.
Yeah. I have to preface this by saying...
You win. No, I'll just finish. You win.
Yeah, sure.
Very well. You win with a good margin. Your party win with a fabulous margin. But your mentor is gone.
Yeah, absolutely. When I decided that I would quit the Foreign Service, and I asked Rajiv Gandhi for permission, Nafis will remember, because she was in the hotel at the same time. Repeatedly, the SPG was coming and asking me, because I told Rajiv I wanted to say something to him next day. He kept calling me and saying, what is it you want to ask? And I said, no, I'll ask you tomorrow. So I asked him in the aircraft, I said, can I leave the Foreign Service? He was horrified. He said, why do you want to leave an assured career for the uncertainties of politics? And it took about 2 or 3 months for me to persuade him that I really meant it. And then when he admitted me, he said to me, I can never make you a minister. I said, don't make me a minister, but do make me a member of parliament. And then we found that despite my going to various states, he was unable to make me a member of the Rajya Sabha. But then somebody died in Mayiladuthurai, and I grabbed that opportunity to stand for parliament. He had great difficulty giving me the ticket, but he gave me the ticket at the end of April. Then he decided to come to my constituency to canvass for me. He was due there on the 22nd of May, 1991, at 9:20 in the morning. And 11 hours before, at 10:20 the previous night, he went to Maragatham Chandrasekhar's constituency in Sri Perumbudur, and a human bomb killed him. And there, in consequence perhaps of that assassination, everyone in the Congress and the ADMK alliance won the election. I won by a margin of 1.5 lakh votes. But that was because he had been killed. So where I had thought that my life in politics would be under his patronage, and therefore I had nothing to fear, the fact is that I've had to make my way over the last 32 years on my own, without his patronage. I've had some successes, I've had a lot of failures, but I think the difference between a civil servant's life and a political life is that there is a certainty in the civil service that you will rise. The difference is only over the gradient at which you will rise and the point to which you will go. If you're Nirupama Rao, you become the foreign secretary. If you're an ordinary Mani Shankar Aiyar, you'd never make it to foreign secretary. But in politics, you have to go up and down, up and down. And Nafis has written a book in which she talks about her ups and downs. And I, in my critique, said that this is not because she's a woman, it's because she's a politician. All of us go through ups and downs. And if there's one lesson I've learned, it is that the minute you reach the summit is when your descent to the valley begins. And when you hit the floor of the valley, that is when your reascent to the summit begins. So therefore, unless you have patience, perseverance, and a clear idea that ups and downs are part and parcel of a politician's life, I wouldn't recommend anyone to come into politics. It's the most dangerous, but the most rewarding profession of all.
On that note, and we have time for 2 or 3 questions only.
Hi. This is my question to Mr. Mani, obviously.
Little louder, please.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm here, sir. So, the thing about Pakistan, we have 2 people from the foreign service here, and one of them has obviously had a very bad experience when she was interacting with them, right? It isn't so much that we have a problem with the people of Pakistan, but the capriciousness of the people who are in power there, right? Because one day they send a dinghy with people to attack us, and the other day they want to talk peace. Does that ever sort of bother you, which is that the people who actually hold the sword there are so capricious and change their mind? That's my first question. And quickly to the second question.
One question, please. I'm sorry. There are others waiting to ask.
Sure,
please.
okay.
Yeah, answer that, Mani, please.
Obviously, you can't talk to the people of Pakistan. You have to talk to the government of Pakistan. We have seen that if you do talk to the government of Pakistan, and I gave the example so I don't have to repeat it, in Dr. Manmohan's time, there was a continuous dialogue on Kashmir with Pakistan. Earlier, there had been a continuous dialogue at the highest level between the Prime Minister of India and the President of Pakistan on Siachen. And on both occasions, we'd arrived at a conclusion. So if you don't talk to them, obviously you'll solve nothing. If you do talk to them, you have to remember that there will be setbacks, there will be points when you progress, other points when you don't. But the whole point of diplomacy is that you persist until you arrived at a consensus. And it is that process of arriving at a consensus that has been abandoned for the past decade in India.
Yeah, Nirupama, please.
I completely agree with what was just said. You know, talking of the bad experiences I've had with Pakistan, strangely enough, it's not the bad experiences that I remember. I remember, you know, the effort one put in to keep the dialogue going, to keep the home fires burning, literally. And with somebody like Salman Bashir, who was my counterpart as Foreign Secretary in Pakistan, we became wonderful friends, and we still keep in touch. So I think at the human level, we're just the same people, separated by that, you know, Radcliffe line, as it were. And I often say that what goes on between us and Pakistan today is more like a civil war than, you know, a war between nations.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Thank you, sir, for coming to Namma by Bengaluru, and I look forward to reading your book, that is your memoirs. My question is on P.V. Narasimha Rao. What's your opinion on him as being given the credit for the economic reforms that has happened in the 90s? And also the silence on him, is that the diplomat training that you had, that there was silence for so much, and then some comments have come out on him?
P.V. Narasimha Rao is not in this book. He's very much there in the next volume. But I'll answer your question. I'll answer your question with a question that I raised with Vinay Sitapati, who wrote a biography of P.V. Narasimha Rao, in which he described him as half a lion. You know that Narasimha means half a lion. So I said when it came to economic reforms, Narasimha Rao was half a lion. But when it came to the Babri Masjid, he was half a man. So that sums up my evaluation of his prime ministership.
Yes, Abhijit.
Mani, thank you for, and all
Abhijit.
three of you, for a terrific evening. I mean, I wouldn't have gone and seen Oppenheimer or whatever if I had to listen to this. I have a question and I was in the Home Ministry for a while, which you talked about in your important chapter. What was the relationship between Zail Singh and the then Prime Minister?
Excellent question. I have partially answered it. It was that, in my view, it may not be accepted by others, it was certainly Rajiv Gandhi's view also, that as the President of India, the Rashtrapati has to rise above partisan politics in his home province. And just at the time that Rajiv Gandhi, through the Longowal Accord, was attempting to bring peace to Punjab, which had been riven with violence over the last years of his mother's prime ministership, Zail Singh was so opposed to the Akali Dal that he, as President of India, was subverting the policies of his government. How can a president actually try to sabotage his own prime minister? And now K.C. Singh has written a biography of his days in, an autobiography really, of his days in Rashtrapati Bhavan as Deputy Secretary to Zail Singh. It's called The Indian President.
It was
in
launched
that
here.
Book,
It was launched here.
oh, yes, it was launched here. In that book, it's not me saying it, K.C. Singh describes how Zail Singh was attempting to contact Congress leaders, opposition leaders, journalists, anyone who could find, who would get the elected government of Rajiv Gandhi, which was in a majority of 400 seats or more, disturbed. Why? Because he wanted to reverse the Punjab policy. So that was a very bad relationship. But then R.K. Dhawan was brought in because he'd had a major role to play in getting Indira Gandhi to appoint Zail Singh as the president, and he effected a reconciliation between them. And after that, Zail Singh actually told Ritu Sorin of the Indian Express that he was attempting, this is a story in the Express, a lead story, that he was attempting to collect 40 crore rupees to overthrow the Rajiv government. So if that's the way in which a president wants to function, you can't have a constitutional office functioning that way.
Yes,
Mani,
Mr. Dasgupta.
this is P.R. Dasgupta.
Oh, where are you? Hello, Bambi.
Well, as a former college colleague and then later on in service, I have seen the irreverent side of your character very well. And during my stay in Mussoorie also. I have also known your younger brother, Swami, who's equally irreverent. Now, I was wondering, is the streak of irreverence in your family a kind of a...
Yes, I think my mother was not only was irreverent herself, but encouraged irreverence in us. We lived in a very religious house. And my brother and I became firm atheists at the age of 15. We would rebel against these bhajan mandalis and constantly going to the Shivananda ashram. And yet, despite that, despite knowing that her children did not agree with her, she never stoppered our mouth. So from her we learned how to be independent in your thought, but to take the consequences of your speech and your action. You can't be irreverent and then expect people whom you've been irreverent towards to be kind to you. So you say what you want, knowing full well that you're going to be attacked by the people you attack.
We've exceeded the time limit by 2 minutes, and BIC should forgive us for that. Mani, all the best with your book. I'm told your critics are buying it secretly and lapping it up. Your fans are buying it openly and reading it and complimenting you. All the best for your next. And thank you so much, Nirupama. Thank you, Mani. Thank you all. Thank you.